All right. Well, let me begin with the land acknowledgement. Trinity Western's main campus in Langley is located on the traditional ancestral unceded territory of the Stalo people. Just want to make that recognition and introduce Paul tonight. Paul is professor of Old Testament at McMaster Divinity College in Hamilton, Ontario. He came to McMaster in 2009, and I had the opportunity to work with Paul for 14 years. He's a great friend and was a great colleague. Before the Divinity College, Paul taught biblical studies at Ambrose University and seminary for 3 years. Paul completed his PhD at St. Michael's at the U of T and served several churches in pastoral ministry before and while he was finishing his graduate studies. At McMaster Divinity College, Paul teaches a range of courses from Old Testament theology, biblical wisdom, to Psalms, Isaiah, the history of ancient Israel, and biblical Hebrew. Paul has supervised professional degrees, MTS, MDiv, MA, and PhD, and also advanced Doctor of Practical Theology. He served as primary mentor for over at some point I stopped counting or lost count. My fingers wouldn't keep up. Over 18 PhD students. Paul has given dozens of presentations at the Society of Biblical Literature and other academic conferences, and is currently working on a monograph on the life of David for IBP. And I think the one commentary is finished, and working on a second one. And one of which 400,000 words. That's long. That's like, yeah, hurt your back, carry around it sort of book. And those are for the New International Commentary on the Old Testament and published by Erdman's. In addition, Paul is the author of numerous articles, book chapters, edited books, and 2 monographs related to the subject of his presentation tonight, which is the Assyrian invasion and the effort to annex Judah under King Sennacherib. Connecting the ancient text of the Bible to the issues of contemporary Christian thought, life, and ministry is a central feature of Paul's teaching and scholarly work, which is why his presentation tonight is not only about an ancient military campaign in the Levant, but also about ways this conflict and its interpretation informs contemporary ways of understanding history and world events today. The order of events today or tonight, Paul will give his presentation, which will go about 3.5 hours, which will take 40 minutes. After Paul, we have an interdisciplinary panel from Trinity Western faculty that includes Robyn Healey. She's professor of history and chair of the History, Political Studies, and International Studies Department here at Trinity Western. Leanne Smythe, who is assistant professor of political studies and program director for political studies, and also Shannon Parratt, who is assistant professor of biblical and theological studies here at Trinity Western. Each panel will come up after Paul's presentation and take about 5 minutes. And after the panel, each panel member presents, everyone will come up here, and then we'll open it up for a discussion amongst the panelists and Paul and the audience. And with that, turn it over to you, Paul.
Great, thanks a lot, Steve. Welcome. How do we know who actually wins? This is the subject of my talk tonight. In sports, the answer sounds simple. You have points on a scoreboard, maybe the fastest time, the Olympics are going on, the highest difficulty rating. Sometimes we even judge, depending on the sport, the beauty or the execution or the artistry involved in the event. But the moment human judgment enters the equation, things get a little complicated. Suddenly, winning isn't just about performance, it's about perspective. And when that perspective belongs to a handful of judges, there's often controversy. If you're watching the Olympics, you're going to see some of that. You know what I'm talking about. But what about in war? When a war ends, somebody declares victory, typically. But the real question is, how do we know that they're right? Most of what we know about ancient and modern wars come through us through stories. How do we assess the claims of victory in historical writings, especially when the history is often written by those who claim to be the winners? What exactly makes an historical claim move from the realm of history into propaganda? And at what point does history stop informing us and start persuading us? Well, tonight I'm going to look at one of the most studied military campaigns from the ancient Near East that is part of what we could call biblical history. That's the invasion of Judah in 701 BCE by the notorious Assyrian king Sennacherib. In this lecture, I'm going to refer to this as the War of 701. Without a doubt, the War of 701 is the most documented historical event in Israel's history prior to the Neo-Babylonian period. It's an event that continues to capture the imagination of biblical scholars and historians alike. Why? Why does everyone find this so interesting? Well, for one thing, the Old Testament clearly finds it important. Did you know that this story is told 3 times in the Old Testament? In 2 Kings 18:19, Isaiah 36:37, and 2 Chronicles 32. 3 times, that's almost as much as Jesus. Jesus has a story 4 times. Not that it's a competition. But if the Bible's focus on this War of 701 isn't enough to interest you, amazingly, the War of 701 is also narrated by the Assyrian king himself, Sennacherib. He declared how important it was because not only did he write it in a lot of inscriptions that I'll talk about in a bit, but he has this huge elaborate piece of artwork that he had commissioned to decorate his palace, where he on the artwork he talks about displays in artwork the siege of Lachish, an important Judahite city, the second most important city in Judah at the time. Speaking of Lachish, Lachish itself has been excavated thoroughly, the assault in 701 especially, and scholars have been excavating this for a long time. There's a wealth of evidence about the war. Well, given this wealth of evidence, you would think that we'd have a pretty broad consensus of who won the war. Well, if you thought that, you'd be wrong. Despite all this relevant material, historians can't agree on a basic question: who exactly won? The main reason why there's such differences of opinion comes down to the fact the Bible seems to claim that Sennacherib lost, whereas Sennacherib in his annals calls it an unmitigated victory for Assyria. So tonight we'll look at the evidence and consider the claims from both sides of the war. But to help us think about these diametrically opposed opinions, I also want to think about a more recent example of disputed history, and that's the War of 701. I mean, War of 1812. I'm going to get confused for those two. The War of 1812 is an example of disputed history, and the War of 1812 was between Canada and the United States. So, gotta love that, right? Well, Britain and the United States. We'll talk more about it as we get. But I hope by placing 1812 side by side with 701, we can see perhaps get a perspective on how victory is more than battlefield results, but often about storytelling, memory, and perspective, and how our own cultural assumptions help us interpret wars of the past. So first of all, we'll look at the War of 701 according to Assyria. And this all starts, it's an exciting story that Spielberg could have directed because it starts with Austin Henry Layard. He was basically Indiana Jones. You can look up him more. He was an archaeologist. He was also an adventurer who did a lot of traveling, and he discovered some amazing things. He excavated and discovered Nineveh and Nimrud. And in 1851, Henry Rawlinson, who is the father of Assyriology, he examined a massive winged bull colossi that Layard had discovered, and he claimed that he found Hezekiah's name written. That was pretty exciting at the time. These winged bulls he discovered are called lamistu, and they look like this, and they have inscriptions in there. You can see the inscription there. I'm sure you're all reading it as we speak in cuneiform. But anyway, he found on one of these bulls the name Hezekiah. That's pretty exciting. And a year after this, he published Sennacherib's Prism, which becomes known as the Taylor Prism, which gives Sennacherib's account of the War of 701 and talks about what he did with Hezekiah. And this is now on display in the British Museum. But as time went on, more and more copies of Sennacherib's annals were discovered. The oldest account, it appears, is the Rassam cylinder, which is also in the British Museum. And it dates to 700 BC, only a year after the campaign. So it's the oldest account we have. Another copy is the Chicago Prism. And yes, that is a picture of me taking a selfie with the Chicago Prism when I was in Chicago. This is what scholars do. We love to take selfies with famous artifacts, right? Not seeing any nodding from the other scholars. Yes, thank you. Thank you. And there's another one as well in Israel. I had a chance to go to Israel last fall, and I went to the Israel Museum because I wanted to see it and get another selfie. And I searched for it actually for about an hour with the help of staff, and it turned out it had been temporarily removed. So I haven't seen it in person. But anyway, but it does exist. And it turned out in December they were putting on this Sennacherib display. But we have at least 4 different cylinders that give Sennacherib's version of events. And in fact, Assyriologist Eckhard Fram tells us that Sennacherib's account of the War of 701 was mass produced. And he says that there were 74 different copies produced within the first few days of the first cylinder. So it was a mass produced. It sounds like a lot of Assyrian evidence. Of course, there's more. I already hinted at it. We have the Lamassu bowls that mention this, and we have the Lachish relief, which is also in the British Museum. This is a massive 80-foot-long relief depicting the siege and conquest of the city of Lachish, and it was commissioned to decorate Sennacherib's palace in Nineveh. Lachish was the second most important city in 701 behind Jerusalem, and the sculpture is an artistic account of Sennacherib's perceived glory in the War of 701. It's unique of all Assyrian artwork in that it has so many soldiers and besieging a city. No other piece of artwork has the same thing. This is a picture here of, you can see Sennacherib's throne. We'll get a closer look, but here you have all the bowmen. There's a bunch of slingers. It's actually a fascinating, you can look on the British Museum's website and look at it in detail. It's really, I love looking at this thing. It's so fascinating to see the detail. On it, you can see these siege machines that they had. I outlined it in red here. These siege machines they used to pierce the walls, and it's fascinating to learn about how they would take on these cities, the Assyrian war machine. And then it showed Sennacherib in his camp and on his throne, and it has an inscription. It says, Sennacherib, king of the world, king of Assyria, sat on the throne as the spoils of Lachish were paraded before him. So given his picture and his inscription, some scholars think the main purpose of this artwork was actually to prove that he was there. No, you don't believe that I conquered the West? Look, I'm in the picture. That could have been what it's all about. But the relief depicts the violent attack on the city, including the torture and mutilation of prisoners. Elsewhere, Sennacherib claims that this palace that he built was to be called, he calls it a palace without rival. He said it was to be filled with splendor for the astonishment of the people. So his choice to depict Assyrian power and skill at war shows what he thought was splendid. Looking at the relief, we see no Assyrian weakness portrayed, no alternative measures undertaken. In Assyrian memory, the enemy bowed to the power of Sennacherib in pitched battle, and Lachish is displayed as a prime example. The artwork basically says what we see in the cylinders. So I'll talk a little bit about what he says. Sennacherib claims, so here we got a picture of coming from Nineveh. He heads down the coast, and first of all, he claims in his annals that he fights the Phoenician and Philistine cities. He claims that they gave up largely without a fight, and they just submitted to him when he showed up. And I have some quotes from it on there. How did he do this? How was he so successful? Well, in his cylinder, he claims that it was the weapon of his lord Ashur, that's the name of the Assyrian god, overwhelmed them, or else just the splendor of his lordship overwhelmed the enemy. What do you think? Is this real victory, or is this spin? Is this propaganda, military success? Maybe both. Afterwards, Sennacherib claims he attacked those who would not submit. He claims that the coast mostly just submitted to him without a fight, but there were some that he had to fight against, and he would depose the rebellious kings and replace them with obedient kings, or new kings, puppet kings that he would put into place. This seems to be his policy. In his annals, just in the War of 701, he does this at least 3 times in the annals. One of those who did not submit to his rule was the city of Ekron. city of Ekron a Philistine city. He talks about what he does with Ekron. The population had had enough of Assyrian rule, wanted to rebel, even though their king did not. So the population of Ekron deposed Padi, their king, and amazingly, it says in Sennacherib's annals, they sent him to Jerusalem to Hezekiah to hold. So Hezekiah held him prisoner. In order to defeat Ekron, however, Sennacherib first had to fight with the Egyptian and Cushite forces. In the Battle of El Teka, is in all of Sennacherib's annals talks about it, where he has a pitched battle with the Egyptians and the Cushites. Scholars point out that it may not have been the unmitigated victory that Sennacherib claims, though. There's no mention of the booty that's collected, no mention of prisoners. It seems kind of odd. Sennacherib claims to have taken part in the battle himself. Some scholars think this may mean that the battle was not the cakewalk that Sennacherib claims it was. Some even suggest it might be a defeat that he's kind of papering over. After the Battle of El Teka, Sennacherib goes back to the city of Ekron, and he takes the treasonous officials, those who deposed the faithful Padi, and he killed them or took them as spoil and deported them. And he installed a faithful king, Padi, on the throne. After all this, of defeating the Phoenicians and the Philistines, we finally hear what he does to Judah. The most famous part of the text, Sennacherib claims to have besieged and conquered 46 fortified cities of Judah. And he says, as well as towns without number. In fact, he describes his military tactics and the way he besieges them in great detail. It's a pretty impressive military campaign that he describes there. But what about Jerusalem? Jerusalem, the capital. When it comes to Jerusalem, famously, he says, Hezekiah, I shut him up like a bird in a cage. If you know anything about this story, you've probably heard that phrase before. That's a great phrase, but what does it mean? What does it really mean? I shut him up like a bird in a cage. Scholars used to argue that this meant he besieged Jerusalem, shut him up like a bird in a cage. But it's now clear that there was no actual siege of Jerusalem in 701. The city may have been subject to a blockade or at least military threats, but no, it was not actually besieged. In fact, scholars have noticed that the phrase like a bird in a cage shows up in other Assyrian writings, and it's always in a context where they were unable to take the city. But they say, we shut him up like a bird in a cage. So it's this enemy of mine was like a little Tweety bird, but Sylvester the cat couldn't actually get him. Probably you're all too young to know the reference. Another important claim Sennacherib makes in his annals is that he annexed much of the territory of Judah. And he turns it over to the Philistines, he says in his annals. Taking Sennacherib at his word, some historians therefore think Judah shrunk significantly after the War of 701, and that Hezekiah's power and influence was diminished significantly. We'll come back to that claim later. Finally, Sennacherib explained why Hezekiah submitted to him. He says Hezekiah was overwhelmed by the splendor of his lordship. Imagine winning a battle just due to shock and awe. Sounds like a strategy George W. Bush did in the initial attack on Iraq. Have you heard of the shock and awe program? The idea was to paralyze the enemy psychologically, break the enemy's will to fight before they could really fight. Didn't really work in Iraq, but Sennacherib claims it was a reliable strategy in 701 in his campaign. Maybe we could be a bit skeptical that really worked. Might lead us to say, whatever, sure. But Sennacherib's text ends listing the tribute Hezekiah sent after Sennacherib has returned to Nineveh, he says. This is actually a bit odd, seeing as the other kings in the story were all deposed and were replaced with puppet kings, and they all gave tribute in person and paid homage on the spot. Perhaps Sennacherib was trying to put a good spin on the results of the war. So that's the Assyrian view, but what does the Bible say? The War of 701, as I said, is told 3 times. I'm going to focus on the book of Kings, which is the book of Isaiah is very, very close, and the book of Chronicles is written quite a bit later. The first data in the text in 2 Kings 18 that's relevant for the War of 701 is we read about Hezekiah attacking Philistia. It says in verse 8 that he attacked as far as Gaza. This is interesting because Gaza does not get mentioned in Sennacherib's annals. We don't know if he fought with Gaza, he liberated Gaza, it doesn't tell us, but the Bible chooses to focus on Gaza. Why the difference? Probably Hezekiah's attack on Gaza was to secure its participation in the rebellion against Assyria. Remember, Sennacherib had mentioned the Philistine city of Ekron had deposed their king, sent the king to Hezekiah. So Hezekiah was clearly working with them. The Philistines trying to make sure they would go along plan probably is why he's attacking them here. It's interesting to me, the Bible doesn't mention Ekron, which Sennacherib focuses on, and Sennacherib doesn't mention Gaza. So they both focus on different Philistine cities. Maybe Gaza was something of an embarrassment for Assyria, but an occasion to boast for Hezekiah. Maybe Sennacherib's success at Ekron and the liberation of Patti was a proud moment for the Assyrians, but maybe it would be an embarrassment for Hezekiah because he returned Patti. Maybe, we don't know. Both may be historical fact, but each source perhaps omits or emphasizes them for what we could call propagandistic reasons. But the Bible says Sennacherib had initially a lot of success. It's very similar to what Sennacherib claims. The Bible tells us he sent he seized all the fortified cities of Judah, the Bible says. Sennacherib said he captured 46 cities, right? So the two sources are pretty close to agreement in this instance. The Bible says Hezekiah submitted to Sennacherib in 1814. It says when he was at Lachish, he sent messengers and was negotiating with the king a form of payment for him to leave. He says, what will you have me pay if you'll leave? Strangely, although Lachish is that big artwork that he puts in his throne room, Sennacherib never mentions Lachish in any of his writings. I think that's interesting, where the Bible does. It's interesting what they mention and what they don't. Contrary to the Assyrian text, Hezekiah pays tribute to Sennacherib before he goes to Nineveh. Or if you remember what I said about the cylinders, he always pays him after he's returned to Nineveh. So that's a difference going on there. The sources do agree on the amount of gold. Both say that they paid 30 talents of gold, which is really a remarkable agreement. The Bible claims he only paid 300 talents of silver, whereas Sennacherib claims he paid 800. So there's some differences as well. But the Bible emphasizes this Assyrian delegation to Jerusalem. If you know the story in the Bible, this takes up a big part of the narrative. After accepting payment from Hezekiah, Sennacherib sends further threats. He sends the Rabshakeh and other Assyrian officials to demand surrender. But no negotiations are mentioned in the Assyrian text. So that's interesting. And this is significant because negotiations must have taken place at bare minimum to get Patti released so he could restore him to Ekron. So there must have been something going on, but maybe Sennacherib doesn't mention the negotiations because they didn't end up meeting the war aims that were communicated. So the Rabshakeh, basically the war aims he communicates to the Jerusalemites are as follows. He first demands the surrender of Jerusalem. He claims that there's going to be a lengthy siege of Jerusalem, he says in verse 27, and that Assyria would deport the people of Jerusalem and take them to a new land, he says in verse 32. So from Judah's perspective, since Assyria did not follow through with any of this, they never took Jerusalem, they never deported them, their war aims failed. So they're not successful in the war, you could say. We could argue that these war aims that were communicated to the Jerusalemites may not be something Assyria really needed to have happen. You know, it's kind of like, we'll take Greenland by force if we have to, but really I'm okay with just the way things are and a little bit more mineral rights than what's going on. But anyway, the demands made are not always the actual strategic demands that are required. But from the Judite perspective, the Assyrians clearly failed in these war aims. So from the Judite perspective, they failed in the war. Then there's the role of Assyria and Cush, the battle with Egypt and Cush. Interestingly, of course, the Battle of Eltekeh is narrated in the Assyrian text. The Bible tells us about the advance of Tirhakah, king of Cush, in chapter 19, verse 9, and it leads the Assyrian king to have to go out and meet him in battle. But the Bible doesn't tell us all the details about the battle. Remember how in Sennacherib's annals he focused on this Battle of Eltekeh. He fought the Cushite forces and seemed to say it was a major victory. In the Bible, nothing more is said about the Cushites or the Egyptians other than Tirhakah was approaching. The Assyrians no longer approached Jerusalem after this, though. Instead, only send threatening letters in chapter 19. So this thing could imply Sennacherib was too busy fighting the Egyptians to continue to focus on Jerusalem. But the climax of the biblical account, or maybe it's the final battle, describes an angelic attack on the Assyrian camp in verse 35. And it results in 185,000 Assyrian casualties. So Sennacherib is forced to return to Nineveh. Needless to say, this claim of the text is the most disputed historically. The number 185,000 seems to be too large, given that Palestine is thought to have only a total population of around 400,000 at the time. It should be noted that both the Bible and the Assyrian account both have massive numbers in their accounts. Sennacherib's annals claim to have deported 200,000 people from Judah, although scholars tell us, based on archaeological surveys, that they probably only had 110,000 people. So inflated numbers, they don't necessarily require rejection of the historical kernel behind the claim. Some scholars suggest that they should be seen as impressionistic, meaning, a very large amount of people. Not entirely clear where this angelic attack is thought to take place in the biblical narrative. Some scholars assumed it was on the walls of Jerusalem, around the walls of Jerusalem. But if you read in the text, the last time we see Sennacherib's army is it's going out to meet Tirhakah, the Cushite king. And then we get these letters sent to Jerusalem and then the angelic attack. So perhaps the losses are thought to be in this conflict with the Egyptian Cushite forces. But why isn't the Bible more clear on this? Perhaps, again, it's an issue of spin or propaganda, or maybe, to say it more sympathetically, perspective. Remember, Sennacherib seemed to claim an outright victory over the Egyptians, the Cushites. Scholars note that the account might be hiding something. But if the battle with the Egyptians was either an Egyptian victory or even a stalemate, it's easy to see why Sennacherib would not want to include that in his account. Similarly, I think the Bible might be hesitant to acknowledge a positive contribution by the Egyptian army in the withdrawal of Sennacherib. After all, in the Bible, it always emphasizes you rely on Yahweh and not other nations, especially not Egypt. There's many oracles in Isaiah about this. So the reference to Egypt, though, is there in this story, though the narrator attributes the ultimate victory to the angel of the Lord, not the Pharaoh. So according to the Bible, the War of 701 ends with massive losses suffered by the Assyrian army and Sennacherib's return to Nineveh. Or is it a retreat? What's the difference between a return and a retreat? A retreat could be spun as a return, or a return spun as a retreat. It's a matter of perspective, you could say. But they say he who laughs last laughs best. That is, the ultimate winner is only decided after the final battle. So even though the biblical account notes Sennacherib's early and widespread military success, what matters most to the author of the Book of Kings seems to be the final battle, or the angelic assault. Even though Sennacherib claims that all he does is win, 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 no matter what, the Bible records an Assyrian defeat. Sennacherib returns home. He breaks camp and returns home. And it says that he stays there, basically, because he dwells in Nineveh. So we can compare the Bible and the biblical accounts, and there's a lot of similarities, but some key differences as well. To summarize what we covered, both biblical and Assyrian sources agree the Assyrians captured the fortified cities of Judah. Hezekiah pays Sennacherib a heavy tribute. Both Assyrian annals and the biblical text say he paid 30 talents of gold. There's a discrepancy in the amount of silver, though. But most importantly, there's a disagreement regarding the outcome of the war of 701. According to Assyrian texts, it was an unequivocal victory for Sennacherib, while the biblical texts record an Assyrian defeat that resulted in Sennacherib's return to Nineveh. So where do we go from here? How and why could both sides claim victory? This is where I want to talk about the War of 1812. Gain some perspective, we're going to look at this example of disputed victory from military history. One of the most well-known aspects of the War of 1812 is that Canada won. No, I'm sorry, that's not sorry. I didn't read my notes right. That both Canada and the United States claimed victory in this conflict. And the Americans tend to think they won the war. Canadians think they're the victors. And it's not only popular opinions, there are scholarly disagreements over this as well. In fact, both sides of the conflict have developed what has been called widely divergent national and local historiographies about the War of 1812. So tonight I'm going to focus on some reasons why each side thought they won their respective victory, and compare the reasons with divergent opinions on the War of 701. So reasons for war in 1812. Why would the U.S. ever attack Canada? Well, Americans would never do that. Did they? Even rhetorically? Anyway, let's stick with this. Well, Americans went to war in 1812 for economic, political, and ideological reasons. Judging by the debates in Congress in 1812, American aims were primarily to stop British restrictions placed on American trade with continental Europe and British impressment of American soldiers, or sailors, should I say. Basically, Britain was at war with Napoleon's front, and they kind of like using economic sanctions to control states today. They were policing the seas to stop trade with France, and so they wouldn't let the U.S. Trade. Furthermore, the British needed manpower for the war. So when a British vessel came across an American vessel on the ocean, they would often board the vessel and impress sailors, that is, make them serve in the British Navy, especially if they said he had a British accent. Like, blimey, Governor, I'm an American. But no, you're not. They would just make you serve in the British Army. America saw this as a violation of their sovereignty, and the U.S. was not going to have any more of this. The truth is, U.S. war aims were not limited to maritime issues, though, but also included the conquest of Canada with a view to gaining the farmland. Canada was seen as an easy target, but there's a famous quote here from Thomas Jefferson saying, "The acquisition of Canada would be a mere matter of marching." The popular opinion even today. After all, the U.S. had a much larger population than Canada, 7.7 million to around 500,000. Many thought Canadian loyalty was divided. You had the French already hating the British. Some Canadians were just Americans who went up north to get free land. A congressman named Henry Clay said to Congress, "The conquest of Canada is," oops, oh, it's already on the phone. "It was in your power." He says, "I trust I shall not be deemed presumptuous when I state that even the militia of Kentucky are alone competent to place Montreal and Upper Canada at your feet." They didn't call us the 51st state, but this type of rhetoric seems kind of modern. The conquest of Canada was a significant war aim. Some think it's debatable that maybe it wasn't what they really needed. Canada was not the end, but the means. The object of war being to redress of these injuries, these maritime concerns and independence. But recruitment for the war was often made on the basis of these kind of war claims. Andrew Jackson says that the fight was for the establishment of our national character, for protection and security against future aggression by the conquest of all the British dominions of the continent of North America. I don't talk about it in this paper, but also the manifest destiny of Americans kind of was exacerbated, increased through this war, we could say. Leanne explains, "Many Americans sincerely believe that only by conquering Canada would the British once and for all be removed as a threat to the United States." So having provided some context for the War of 1812, we'll think about why does both sides have a claim to why they won? First of all, why do the Americans think they won? Well, there's certain battles that they memorialize or remember over other battles. So certain victorious battles are emphasized. They consider themselves the victory because they privilege the memory of certain successful battles over other less successful battles. For example, after a major loss in 1814, when the British took Washington, D.C., Americans recall their success in the Battle of Baltimore that happened after. In fact, this success had been enshrined in a national anthem written during the British bombardment at Baltimore, recalling the rockets' red glare, showing that the flag was still there at Baltimore. Besides which, while Canadians temporarily occupied Washington, they eventually abandoned it, and by the end of the war, all American territory held by the British was returned, so the borderlines were unchanged. Winning the last battle. An American victory is perceived due to the fact that the Battle of New Orleans was an American victory. It was the last major battle in the war. Even though the peace treaty of Ghent, signed in Europe, was already signed and was making its way across the ocean when the battle happened, the news of the U.S. victory of New Orleans arrived 10 days before the peace treaty, so it seemed like they basically dictated the terms of peace because they won that final battle. Most significantly, intangible benefits. American opinion was that after the dust settled on the war, they believed their country was more respected as a result of the war, had proved its strength and its independence. The result was an increased pride in the nation and a feeling of greater security as they believed they had eliminated British threats to U.S. sovereignty. So, in sum, the Americans came out of the war with memorable victories, without losing any territory, winning the final battle, and regaining respect and prestige. In some perspectives, these accomplishments, by any other name, would mean an American victory. So how about the Canadians? Okay. Well, first of all, an important factor for Canadians thinking they won is the failure of U.S. war aims. They believe the goal of the Americans was to conquer Canada, and their failure suggests a Canadian victory. Whether or not the conquest of Canada was a true war aim for the U.S. could be debated, but these war aims were explicitly communicated to Canadians. More importantly, this war aim was not achieved. The Americans failed to take even a small part of Canada. Canada lost no land whatsoever for all the American aggression and effort. Second, memorable, victorious battles. Like Americans, Canadians privilege certain memories over others. For example, Canadians remember they successfully invaded and occupied the U.S. Capitol, Washington, D.C. They burned many public buildings, including the presidential palace. When they rebuilt the presidential home, they had to paint it white because of all the burn marks, and that's why it's the White House. Taking the capital of a nation, though, is symbolically important and is remembered by Canadians as a sign of Canadian victory. Like Americans, Canadians remember victorious battles and heroes in the conflict. One legendary hero is Laura Secord. When invading Americans had sent troops to launch a surprise attack at British positions, they spent the night in Queenston, which is where Laura Secord lived, and it was a Canadian village occupied by the Americans. She overheard the Americans talk about their plan. She set out to warn the British, and she undertook a long, arduous 27-kilometer journey through the woods to go warn the British troops. And due to the advance warning provided by Laura Secord, the British, though a much smaller force, were able to ambush the U.S. contingent and stop them. Her heroic deed was actually not very well known during her lifetime. It was largely forgotten until 1816, when the Prince of Wales and future King Edward came and gave her £100 for her service. She lives on today because she's the chocolate queen, right? We all know her for chocolate. I asked my daughter the other day, who takes history in school, if she heard of Laura Secord, and all she knew was the chocolate. But actually, she has been celebrated in plays, in literature, in the theater, and she is a Canadian hero. So memorable battles, the futility of the final battle. So Canadians think they got the last laugh because they disregard the Battle of New Orleans. After all, it was fought after the war was technically over. The two countries had already made peace in Europe. There was no way for the British government to call off the war. They couldn't email them or text them. In Canadian perspective, winning a battle after the war was over and the peace treaty decided upon hardly shows victory in the war. So the Battle of New Orleans doesn't count. But for Canadians, a shared common tradition was very important. The War of 1812 was a win for Canada due to its unifying effect on the country. The tiny population of Upper Canada was quite diverse, with less patriotism than their southern neighbors. But the war, however, changed Canadians from a loose aggregation of village states into something approaching a political entity. Canadian historian Pierre Burton suggests it was not so much the war, but the myth of the war that gave Canadians this new awareness of community. He writes, "In the end, the myth became the reality. As the years went by and the memories dimmed, old scars healed, and old grudges evaporated, as aging veterans reminisced and new leaders hyperbolized, the settlers began to believe they had repelled the invader almost single-handedly. For the first time, Upper Canadians shared a common tradition." So the enduring legacy of 1812 was that the Canadians had a common tradition that unified its diverse population. So you could say the Canadians were the winners of the war. Keeping in mind these types of ways of understanding victory, how about the War of 701? What could we learn? Well, first of all, war aims. As was the case in 1812, the achievement or failure of war aims are key to perceptions of victory. When the U.S. said they were going to annex Canada, but did not, this was a significant victory for Canadians. When the Assyrian messenger, the Rabshakeh, tells the people in Jerusalem they're going to take the city and deport the population, and they failed to do so, Judahites could think that they won the war. Similar to 1812, regarding loss of land, both Canadian and Americans point to the fact they didn't lose any land as pointing to their success. Similarly, Hezekiah's Judah actually appears to have returned to its antebellum borders following the Assyrian invasion. Remember, Sennacherib claims to have annexed some of his territory. Many scholars point out archaeologically, the borders of Judah don't seem to have changed. It was probably only the gains he had made in Philistia that went back to Philistia. How about losing the last battle? He who laughs last laughs best. As we saw, the last battle is important for the Americans with the Battle of New Orleans. I'm suggesting a victory, while the Canadians say it didn't really count. Well, Judah perceived Assyria to lose the last battle in the war, likely with the Cushite Egyptian forces at El Teka, interpreted as Yahweh's direct involvement in the war. And so that would suggest an Assyrian loss of the war. I don't have time to talk about it, but some people point to Herodotus' text. Herodotus, the Greek historian, has an account of Sennacherib's defeat with a plague of field mice that attack his camp in the middle of the night, eat up all the bowstrings and the shield handles, and they have to retreat. So some people think when the Bible talks about the angelic attack, it's very similar to the Greek tradition of this kind of miraculous nature of the loss of the last battle. But intangible benefits. In the example of 1812, we saw perceptions of victory involved intangible elements like prestige, renewed patriotism. Similarly, despite the devastation of Judah, these intangibles were likely important for Judahites in 701. They could have cast the rebellion on Hezekiah's leadership in a positive light. The legacy of the War of 1812 was important for the U.S. With Manifest Destiny and other lore that comes out of the war I don't have time to get into. But probably the Bible or Judah similarly has legends that come out of this that strengthen their ideologies. The survival of Judah, scholars tell us, probably emphasized the inviolability of Zion, that Zion couldn't be defeated, which becomes a problem for Jeremiah when the Babylonians approach. But anyway, the survival of Judah likely validated worship of Yahweh. His father Ahaz had denigrated Yahweh worship, but due to this deliverance, it grew. Antipathy toward Assyria probably grew out of this as well. The book of Nahum, if you know it in the Bible, criticizes Assyria extensively. And of course, the Bible records the story 3 times in the Old Testament. They obviously thought it was an important event. In Assyria, the campaign was also remembered fondly as well, as we saw in the mass production, maybe 74 copies of the text produced in short order. And they attribute the victory to the hand of their god Asher as well, kind of like the Bible attributes the angel of the Lord with the victory there. Assyrian pride in the campaign can be seen in that massive artwork we looked at. Sennacherib's populace would not question the truth of his victory there, obviously, given the nexus of power and knowledge in Assyria, and Sennacherib remained in power afterwards. From the Assyrian perspective, essential war aims were accomplished. As in 1812, where American war aims did not require the annexation of Canada, Assyrian war aims did not require the taking of Jerusalem or the deportation of its citizens or deposing the king, Hezekiah. But similar to how Canadians viewed the burning of the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. as more important than the defense of Baltimore, from Judah's perspective, Jerusalem's survival was more important than the loss of Lachish. From an American perspective, the defense of Baltimore was more significant and not only stopped the British advancement, but led to the writing of the national anthem. From an Assyrian perspective, the failure to take Jerusalem was spun as inconsequential. The taking of Lachish, though, that was a huge accomplishment. Let's build a whole artistic relief to celebrate it. So, having looked at all the evidence and considering a modern example of disputed victory alongside the War of 701, I think we've seen how victory is not always about battlefield results, but more about storytelling, memory, and perspective. In my view, I think that through the consideration of military history, we conclude that neither Assyria nor biblical texts are primarily deceptive in their presentation of the War of 701 as their own victory. Instead, we should view them as a divergent national or local historiography about the War of 701. When the Assyrians withdrew, no doubt some people in Judah celebrated. In 1815, when the war ended, the reaction to the end of War 1812 was widespread. We can read about how many schools were closed, people stopped working, politicians adjourned their work. There was celebration in the streets, bells were rung, buildings were illuminated, troops turned out to fire a salute. A procession of people ran around with the word peace on their hats. We don't know what happened in Judah. We're not given that kind of scene described in the Bible. No doubt there were differing views among the populace, especially given the loss of loved ones that the war caused. But despite the hardships of the war, the rebellion is remembered fondly and positively in Scripture. The situation might have been analogous to the aftermath of the War of 1812. American historian Donald Hickey writes of the origins of the myth of the American victory in 1812. I'm just going to read what he wrote. He says, as the years slipped by, most people forgot the causes of the war. They forgot the defeats on land and sea. They lost sight of how close the nation had come to military defeat and financial collapse. According to the emerging myth, the United States had won the war as well as the peace. Thus, the War of 1812 passed into history not as a futile and costly struggle in which America had barely escaped defeat and disunion, but as a glorious triumph in which the nation had single-handedly defeated the conqueror of Napoleon and the mistress of the seas. But Canadian historian Pierre Burton writes of Canadians mythologizing, and he says this, quote, the war, or more properly, the myth of the war, gave the rootless new settlers a sense of community. In the end, the myth became the reality. In the long run, it did not matter who fought or did not, who supported the cause or who disdained it. As the years went by and the memories dimmed, as old scars healed and old grudges evaporated, as aging veterans reminisced and new leaders hyperbolized, the settlers began to believe they repelled the invader single-handedly. So changing only what's necessary, if we think about the Assyrian crisis of 701, Judahites appear to have forgotten about the hardships of the war. It didn't matter anymore who had supported the rebellion or opposed it. There's some oracles in Isaiah that seem to be against the rebellion. They ignored the Philistine incursions, ultimately failed to expand Judah's territory. The memory was of a Judahite victory achieved through reliance on their God. The rebellion was remembered as successful. The fortifications created in preparation were remembered as sufficient to the task. Their God's salvation was remembered and celebrated as the cause of the Assyrian retreat. When the biblical history was written up, Hezekiah's achievements are compared to none other than David himself, the king who won Israel's independence. The Assyrian crisis passed into Judahite history not as a futile and costly struggle in which Judah had barely escaped defeat, but as a glorious triumph in which the God of this small nation had repulsed the great empire and shown himself to be more powerful than Sennacherib or his gods. Thanks. There's a little light reading on this if you were interested.
Thank you, Paul. This is the kind of talking about the uses of history. And certainly I think that, and I am a historian, and so I'm going to talk about the War of 1812 tonight. I'm assuming Dr. Parratt might talk about Sennacherib, but I'm going to focus on the War of 1812 and the militia myth in Canadian history. So most historians who study pre-Confederation Canada or Atlantic history contend, as has been presented, that both sides won this war in some way. It was a strategic draw. I need to be clear, however, and I had to cut out like most of my paper on this. Canadians did not go to war with the Americans in 1812. The belligerents in this war were the United States and Britain. In fact, it was the United States that declared war on Britain. The British combatants were comprised of three groups: British Army and British Navy regulars stationed around the empire to carry out the Crown's interests, First Nations warriors who were allies of the British and fought to protect their lands, and militia or local settlers in the colonies of Upper and Lower Canada. That's Upper Canada is present-day Ontario. Well, Upper Canada is a smidgen of what is today present-day Ontario. Lower Canada is present-day Quebec. It was members of this latter group, those local settlers, who worked to shape the narrative after the war to create what is called the militia myth in Canadian history. This would not have been possible without the war being a strategic draw. So, if war is an extension of politics, as Clausewitz tells us, let us consider the war aims or political goals of the belligerents. And Dr. Evans has given us a lot on the various war aims. So some of this will be a American war aims focused on forcing Great Britain to respect maritime rights, stopping the impressment of American sailors, and ending British support for Indigenous resistance on the frontier. Additionally, the US sought to conquer parts of the Canadas as a bargaining chip or to permanently annex the colonies while defending their own national sovereignty and honor. British war aims were primarily defensive, focusing on holding on to British territory in North America. And again, you have to understand this in the context of the Atlantic world, where North America, between 1689, which was the beginning of sort of a series of imperial wars, and the end of the War of 1812, which is the last war for empire, the continent was involved in warfare between imperial powers almost a third of that time. So like it's just was a very so they're trying to protect British territory in North America while maintaining naval supremacy and trade restrictions against Napoleonic France. Negotiations for peace began formally in 1814. At the time, the military situation in North America was so balanced that neither side had achieved their war aims. With Napoleon's abdication in April of 1814, Britain's great diplomats were focused on France, so that the British delegation that appeared at Ghent to negotiate this treaty was not as strong as the American delegation. 4 months of negotiations resulted in status quo antebellum. That means things went back to the way they were. All territorial conquests were to be returned. Hostilities against the First Nations were to be terminated by both sides, and Britain agreed not to arm Indigenous peoples for operations against the US. None of the issues that caused the war or that had become critical to the conflict were included in the treaty. That's why we say was a strategic draw. And in fact, we don't have time to go into this, but really and truly, the real losers of this war were the First Nations in North America. And that's a whole area of scholarship. So Upper and Lower Canada survived as part of British North America, but with a growing sense of identity different from that of their American neighbors, and indeed eventually different from that of the imperial motherland. For colonists in the Canadas, though, and especially those in Upper Canada, the war bred the infamous militia myth that the major battles, and Dr. Evans describes this, that the major battles had been won by a plucky group of part-time citizen soldiers, negating the need for the colonies to invest in professional soldiers. This myth downplayed the incredible influence of career soldiers like Isaac Brock and First Nations chiefs like Tecumseh, and continued to influence military affairs in Canada until after the First World War. So like this militia myth has a huge impact. Upper Canadian politics were strongly dependent on patronage and clientelism, controlled largely by a group known as the Family Compact. Members of the Family Compact magnified and overstated their efforts in the war, using the narrative of the militia myth to prove their loyalty to the crown and to justify their monopoly on power. By claiming credit for defending the colony, they portrayed themselves as essential paternalistic leaders, and they really did tie up this monopoly of power. They were able to control officer appointments in the militia, and it was just this terrible knot of power. As the Family Compact, the Tories entrenched their monopolistic power and political influence on Upper Canadian society through patronage appointments, government offices, and land grants. They deployed their militia myth narrative against their opponents, the reformers, painting them as disloyal to the crown and the colony and ungrateful to the brave men who had fought in the War of 1812. This really and truly was the use of history. The political story, then, of the years between 1815 and the middle of the century is a story of contest over Upper Canadian identity. I completely disagree with Pierre Burton. It was not a congenial road. It was highly contested. The reformers fought for the legitimacy of political dissent and pushed for responsible government. The family compact pushed back, threatening to disenfranchise American born residents of Upper Canada. The rebellions, like we're talking about armed uprising, which does not sound like, oh, hey, we're all happy as Upper Canadians. The rebellions of 1837 and 38 resulted in the reunification of Canada's, and by March of 1848, with a reform government being elected, the colony finally achieved responsible government. The family compact was defeated, but the militia myth lived on. As you can see, we're still talking about it today. So it has certainly given historians much to ponder. Margaret Macmillan, author of War, How Conflict Shapes Us, contends that, quote, how we remember and commemorate war reflects both the nature of war itself and the societies involved, and also who is doing the remembering. Remembrance of past wars often gets tangled up with current social and political debates. Over and over, we see and have seen leaders appealing to past wars to build political support and to promote a particular view of a people or a nation. In 2012, bicentennial commemorations of the War of 1812 triggered a public debate between professional historians who try to be as historically accurate as they can, and politicians or media commentators who prefer the more romanticized flag-waving version of the war we want to see. The lack of a decisive victory on either side leaves the story of the War of 1812 as a tale that can be spun in many ways.
Thanks, Paul. I don't know if this is actually working. I have a cold. Let me clear my throat and I will speak louder. Okay. Thank you, Paul, for your talk tonight. It was very interesting. There were a number of things that I drew from there that I wish I had time to talk about. Initially, I was thinking about the idea of propaganda and how fascinating it is, because my area is international security, and I look particularly at security policy. So if we look at something like propaganda, there's so much we could talk about. However, I didn't go in that direction because I got sidetracked by something else. And so in the paper that you sent out, you talked about this idea that um, cultural assumptions will shape how we view war, whether we view war as right, a good choice or a bad choice. And that today, particularly in our modern time here, there seems to be a bias against war or against militarism. This idea that indeed war is always bad, or that war is so bad that we are actually past war. Particularly since the end of the Second World War, the creation of the United Nations, and everything, all the evolution of international law. It's since that time. And so I thought this was quite an interesting thing, and I just got stuck pondering it a little bit more, particularly the questions of, is peace at all costs worth it? And is there anything that is worth fighting for? So I wanted to talk a little bit about those ideas. And as Dr. Healy brought up Clausewitz, I'm going to go there as well, because as a strategist, that was my first thought. Karl von Clausewitz was a Prussian general in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, and he wrote The Art of War. He became one of the most influential strategists in Western writing, and he writes, quote, "We see therefore that war is not merely a political act, but also a real political instrument, a continuation of political commerce, a carrying out of the same by other means." You've heard this as war is the continuation of politics by other means. You're pretty familiar with that. And the art of war discusses the use of warfare as a policy instrument. It is, in fact, a tool to achieve the national interest as defined by the state. And earlier, he also qualifies this. He says, Thus, therefore, the political object as the original motive of the war will be the standard for determining both the aim of the military force and also the amount of effort to be made. As such, when you choose war as a policy instrument, you're also choosing the kind of tactics and the intensity that should be made directly in proportionate to the political goals you're trying to achieve. So this is the framework for war. It's a political tool, and there's limits on how we wage war towards this assumption of what we can achieve with that tool. Morality for Clausewitz is found in the political goals served by warfare, although he views disproportionate or excessive violence as a political failure. So this is really important. It's really important because it didn't just stay in the 19th century. Okay, so in international relations theory, realist theorists tend to take this approach to warfare. War is a potentially necessary form of political choice when the pursuit of the national interest warrants it. This is generally provoked by the inability to achieve foreign policy goals in any other way. War is costly. Realists understand this. You don't go into war lightly. Okay? Yet it remains as one of the possible tools. And as a rule, then, how you define your war aims is dependent on material interests, not ideational interests. So if you're fighting for a material interest, such as territory, furthering of your economy, greater wealth, political dominance over an enemy, these are material things, and you have a limited policy objective. This helps you guide battlefield strategy, and you know when you win. You win, you go home. Okay. But war fought for non-material interest is irrational. And this can include ideological or religious disagreements, war because of offense or disrespect. It's dangerous because non-material interests have no objective end. And this is where states get sucked into forever wars, crusades, or even the utilization of things like genocide to win the battle. And you can see some of this philosophy, the realist philosophy in both cases presented tonight, that war is seen as a rational response to achieving the national interest. You see Hezekiah leading his nation into military conflict as rebellion against Assyria. Now, I'm not familiar with the case, but I learned a lot from reading the paper and from listening to the talk. And one can suppose that this rebellion is prompted by the desire for freedom, justice for the nation, the chance to throw off the shackles of Assyria and be their own people, and have the expectation of victory. There's a lot of maneuvers Hezekiah went through in order to think that he could maintain victory in this war. You have Sennacherib's war aims to subdue this revolt, to reestablish control over political and economic roots in the vicinity. This wasn't personal. This is power, right? This is resetting up the Assyrian kingdom to be in control and to subdue the rebels. You have American war aims in 1812, stop those British restrictions on U.S. trade. The British impressment that Paul was talking about, the conquest of the Canadian territory to get farmland, the British North American territory that was there. You have the British that are trying to maintain their empire. You have the Canadian militia who are there for self. So you have a whole list of rational reasons why war is the right policy choice in this right policy choice in these circumstances. This still begs the question of whether or not we can see war as good. Not just a rationally correct choice in support of the state, but also a morally correct choice for other reasons. Now, I'm Mennonite, my background. Mennonites are pacifists generally, that's our lineage. So I tend to recoil at this idea that war could be good. But that said, even if you're not a realist, there's other perspectives out there. And I don't know if anyone brought to mind the idea of just war. Right. Just war tradition justifies the use of force under strict conditions. It's based on classical and Christian thinking, and it includes just cause, so the proper motivation, just conduct, the idea of proportionality, and a growing third category, which is just peace. What happens after the war ends? There must be a just peace agreement that moves us towards reconciliation and reconstruction. We've also seen evolution of international law on this kind of area, particularly in the idea of humanitarian intervention. Some of you may be familiar with the document of responsibility to protect. This was created in the early 2000s. And it was a document that outlines the responsibility of the international community to intercede when civilians were being harmed. And this characterizes war as a protective mechanism, that we can utilize violence against a combatant, an enemy, in order to protect people from extreme harm, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. It's a last resort, but it is a possible resort. And I think this kind of war is also referenced in the presentation. Paul said that, quote, military history shows that conflict cannot always be avoided and that peace at all costs is not ideal in the ancient world or even in recent history. And you see that Hezekiah chooses rebellion against Assyria. He provokes war against an unjust but stable power in order to achieve something greater, something that was going to be better for the people. Self-determination, societal justice, we see these as morally good reasons to go to Canada to prevent annexation by the Americans. They mobilized to defend their land, communities. Um, the Canadian, particularly militia we're talking about here, they do not provoke the war. Arguably, Britain is complicit in this whole process, but their option is either submit or fight, and they choose to fight. And this is based on this idea that war can be the moral acceptable. And we have often supported self-defense in that. So why does this matter? A simplistic and broadly sweeping characterization of war as bad and casting those that wage it the role of monster is not only inaccurate, it's unproductive. War might be terrible, but can also be useful, can also be necessary. We do a disservice to history by not trying to fully understand the conditions in that particular context, and particularly trying to understand the actors of history who are making choices without the benefit of hindsight, without the benefit of the whole. We also do a disservice to peacemaking efforts today if we view the choice of war as irrational or unexplainable. There are reasons for war, and there are justice considerations that can make war useful. Knowing the reasons can help policymakers develop relevant solutions. None of this means that we should want war. And this is seen in the UN Charter, which was signed in 1945 at the end of the Second World War. The Charter states the UN was developed to save the world from the scourge of war. This characterized high-level thought about the nature of war and its utility in the post-war era. War, the scourge, is destructive for human beings and is destructive for states. Thus, it was hoped that the UN could render war as unnecessary due to its institutional arrangements of the United Nations for conflict resolution, and too costly due to the threat of punishment through collective security arrangements that would be enacted against defectors. So essentially, according to the UN and post-war thought, war is not only a morally corrupt choice, it is a rationally bad choice. So just we live in a time where the threat and reality of traditional interstate war is increasing. And in this case, it is relevant to ask ourselves that first question: is there anything worth fighting for? And I think the answer here is yes. But there is a cost to that answer, whether war is seen merely as a tool of policy or also as a tool.
Thank you both for your responses, and thank you, Dr. Evans, for your rich paper that explores the complexity of historical narratives and how these narratives participate in identity formation for nations. Because we share a field, and I am also not an Assyriologist, I'm going to frame my 5-minute response on engaging with what you said based on an earlier set version of the paper, which by and large was what was presented tonight. But some things that I say will be, or my first point is something that wasn't presented tonight. So observations, some questions, hopefully we can engage in that. I'm going to try to be fast, Steve, I promise, because I know we're a little bit behind on time. I appreciated your depth of engagement with the Assyrian sources, noting differences within their accounts. This was a part that wasn't necessarily in the explained in depth tonight. Engaged with the Assyrian sources, noting the differences within their accounts, and indeed threading a diachronic aspect to your analysis, at least in the earlier version. And in this respect, I would love to hear you, perhaps in the Q&A time, comment a bit more about these changes within the Assyrian tradition of the so-called War of 701, and what the impetus of the change might have been, but more importantly, what the meaning of these differences might be in some of the differences of what happened when, or who was participating in various things that someone was taken to Cyprus, was it? And then died in the same year. Just the differences between the earlier and the later versions is very interesting. So, for example, you said that the later editions that narrate that Sennacherib's key opponents in the war fled to Cyprus, the latest editions narrating death in Sinir. What's the significance of these changes within the Assyrian tradition itself? How do they participate or not in the broader argument that you're making? And in what way might these changes within the Assyrian account themselves participate in conveying the so-called victory or not? And how might later changes in historical circumstances participate in the existing narrative and then spur on reinterpretation of earlier events in those circumstances? And that can lead to my next point, which is a question that you engage in a sense throughout the paper, but I was wondering about as I was reading your paper. What is victory? What constitutes victory? And does our understanding of what constitutes victory for any of the parties involved whom you discuss, whether Assyria, Judah, Canada, or the US, align with their own understanding what would constitute victory in this sense? What is victory in the ancient Near East? What constitutes it? What shapes that understanding where wars and the involvement in the divine of the rising and falling of cities is par for the course? If the involvement of war aims is indeed a shared concept with the ancient Near East, then how many need to be fulfilled and which ones and who decides most importantly? I'd also ask if this Assyrian evidence you present is articulating victory, which it certainly is in a certain sense, or are there other, perhaps even more prominent messages being communicated that don't even necessarily necessitate victory, but certainly would go very well with it? Power, grandeur, sovereignty, the splendor of our lordship. These sorts of things are all options which are strengthened by victory, but don't necessarily require victory in order for that meaning to be communicated. And so how does these other messages participate in this narrative, and also are maybe more the primary message that is being communicated ultimately? Just a question observation. More significantly in this topic, I wanted to ask about the Judean understanding of victory, which is, so far as I can tell, exclusively with respect to the survival of Jerusalem. Does Judah believe themselves to be a victor or God? Is it that they view Assyria in a different manner now, or is it that they view their God and Jerusalem in a different manner? And you obviously correctly mentioned how these events in 701 BC solidified Zion theology in Judah, this idea that Jerusalem can never be destructed. And so my question about victory with respect to this miraculous survival of Jerusalem is what victory really means to Judah in that reality. Can the victory of Jerusalem's survival only be understood in the context of the destruction of the surrounding cities, including Lachish, which you helpfully described in the Syrian accounts of war? That Jerusalem survived and the other Judean cities did not is what matters in that context, I would suggest, at least with Zion theology. It wouldn't have been strengthened so much had the other cities survived. And thus, could we say that the Assyrian victory with respect to its destruction of the surrounding areas and expansion, or maybe not expansion, is crucial to Judean victory in that Jerusalem, the city of perfection, the indestructible fortress, is not destructed? So is it that Assyrian victory is crucial to the Judean understanding of victory because it's exclusively understood as the survival of Jerusalem amidst everything else that is destroyed? And thus is the idea of who won the right question to be asking if that is the right understanding and the right way that victory would be understood. And indeed, your paper and your book already moved beyond such questions through your analysis of social memory and mythologizing. And that leads to another response that I would want to engage you in. How the mention, this was just a very half a sentence line in his paper. How you mention victory, you mentioned how the victory perceived by Judah in Kings could have led to other prophetic books like Nahum, which celebrates the downfall of Nineveh. And indeed, Nahum is a very difficult prophetic book because of the exuberant celebration of the fall of the Assyrians, engaging the topic of the violence of God. Into that point you made about the book of Nahum, I'd like to insert or bring into this discussion another later prophetic book that has to do with Assyria, but a very different perspective on it, and a book like Jonah, very different prophetic book, also a later text, and a very different perspective. on the matter. It's written in light of and after the Assyrian slaughter of the cities of Judah, and is wrestling with the question of divine mercy for one's enemies. The book would suggest that Assyrian victory, the book of Jonah, pardon me, would suggest Assyrian victory implicitly and explicitly. For the Assyrians win because they respond to God's call to repent and receive the God of Israel's mercy, and then later they win by killing Jonah's own people. Therefore, Jonah is given the impossible task of allowing the Assyrians to live by virtue of their repentance to only later on within the narrative world's timeline, kill his own people. And so how does Jonah problematize our understandings of victory, at least in the Judean accounts? And then my last point, which is the most broadly conceived one, throughout your paper, I kept wondering about what is this understanding of history? I don't think we're understanding that history is purely objective here, but what ought history to be? Do you see the difference between what is considered an account of history today versus 1812 versus in the ancient Near East? Of course, the question of genre in the ancient Near Eastern war account should be mentioned as well. But can history be objective? If so, how and whose perspective is the objective one, and who is the judge of such objectivity? And if it can't be, what does this mean for our understanding of the past and the present? And again, if it cannot be, does history exist in your view in this more objective sense? And that would help us to solve these questions of who won and who didn't, and whose account is right and whose account is wrong. And then if it isn't, what is the aim of telling history? And especially in the ancient Near Eastern context, where it's more the significance of events that's of importance rather than the what have happened, the why of what happened. And indeed, in this context, to convey the significance and meaning of what happened, particularly important in the context of war, where human life and liberty is indeed on the line. So thank you very much. Hopefully we can discuss some of those things.
Anna, do I need this for the people? Yeah. Okay. That was fascinating, interesting all around, from 701, Siege of Jerusalem and Sennacherib, to the militiamen, to international realistic, the school of realism, and then back to 701. So that was good, in for like what, an hour, little over an hour. So very, very cool, and thank you guys for all that you've done to do that tonight. So if you guys have questions to ask each other, that's great. But I'd also like to open up questions to our audience, it could be for Paul or for any one of the panelists in relation to what they said, and also their interaction with Paul. Does anybody have comment, question that you would like one of our speakers to respond to? Yes, Aaron.
Yeah, with respect to, I don't think it's on. Okay, yeah. I lost my train of thought now, but Oh, they are the motivations behind the history telling. I would think that they're similar in many respects. There's ideological motivations, theological motivations. Dr. Evans mentioned the mention of Assyria's god, attributing victory to that. But of course, there's this grander scale that Assyria is operating on versus Israel. It's quite a tiny nothing nation in comparison to the great empires. So there'd be different motivations in that respect. And I think the timing of writing of Israel's scriptures would be of great importance and significance. The writing happened, I forget the exact timeline for all the different um, um, accounts that we have from the Assyrian records of it was written, you said the day after? Yeah. Yeah. And so the motivation for writing, I think, would be different in both contexts. Assyrian records having much in closer proximity to event and I think would have probably a more political and ideological motivation to it, whereas ideology and theology can be similar in a certain sense, but we're in the context of Babylonian exile and trying to figure out the identity of a nation and asking great identity questions of are we still the people of God? Are we not? How do we understand what's happened to our nation? And essentially it's collapsed. So differences in that respect, but happy to have Dr. Evans add anything.
You want to make a contribution? No? Okay. Yeah, Ken. And I'll repeat the question real briefly. Is it the same text on all four Assyrian prisms of I'm assuming it's the attack on Lachish?
Yeah, actually, it doesn't mention Lachish, but it's the third Sennacherib's third campaign. So the Rassam cylinder is the earliest, and the other ones are all copies of it. But as was mentioned, there are some differences between them, the different recensions, which are over different time periods. Like I think I mentioned that the one king, a Tyrian king, is just said to flee away in the earliest text, and then later it says in a later recension he flees to Cyprus, and another one says he died. Another one says he died the same year. So there's this kind of updating that goes on, or a rhetorical updating. Some suggest that it all happening in the same year is more glorifying to Sennacherib, so they added it happened the same year. But they say it probably didn't happen the same year, or they would have mentioned it right away. And so they later found out he died, so then they said he died. So there is an updating going on. But the texts are very, very similar. And some of the translations you'll see will take some readings of one and another. The Taylor Prism was the most famous because it was the first discovered, and a lot of the English translations you find are based on it. Rassam is actually the earliest. It has a much longer booty list at the end. It goes on and on about all the booty, where it's abbreviated in all the other ones. So, and sometimes they'll emphasize Hezekiah is power, like more so than others, to make him more of a villain. So some of the wording is different. Sort of what you might see in the Bible between Kings and Chronicles sometimes, a little more expansion, a little something different, but largely the same.
Another question or comment from audience? Yeah, Dirk.
To Leanne and Paul and all of you. This doesn't work at all. 4 times in the Hebrew Bible we have Israel's God coming across as one who shatters weapons of war. And it's just been on my radar very closely at the moment. And especially since we have Assyrians claiming victory through their gods, we have this kind of counter ideology that crops up every now and again in Psalm 46, Psalm 76, Micah 2, Isaiah 4, or Micah 4, Isaiah 2, where the Lord is against war and everybody must beat their swords into plowshare. How do we respond to that in the light of necessary war, or even the ideas of victory and ideology of war?
Sorry, I didn't see you asking for it.
I wasn't.
Oh, okay. I was just gonna say it is interesting, but I was just thinking of Psalm 46 where he breaks the bow, he burns the chariot in the fire. That almost sounds like war causing peace. Like so the peace that gets accomplished may not always been thought of as apart from violence, but it is interesting.
Yeah. I wish I had a good answer for you, Dirk. I think this is an issue that many Christians have struggled with and continue to struggle with, particularly if you're looking at it from a policy angle, like I am. If I'm a Christian working for a government that commands a military, what do I do with that military? What is my obligation with that military? And to think very, very carefully. And so that's where you have to in some ways, just war criteria does help you the most here, right? Is examining the motivations. Why do I choose to use the military? Is this a last resort? Is it a just cause? Am I committed to seeing this all the way through to an actual peace, a positive peace at the other side that sees people living in justice? If you cannot answer those questions in an affirmative, you have to consider whether or not war is the right tool here. And I think in my studies, we look often at how do we how do we keep ourselves from even having to get to that point of making a decision? Is there a way to see the warning signs so you can stop the progress towards war before it starts? And that's where you have fields of peace studies. Of my master's was in negotiation and mediation, the idea of trying to deal with conflict before it turns into a hot war. You also have people looking at root causes of war. What causes war to happen? How can we deal with that? And at the end of the day, what we can't prevent, we have to stop. So then, how do we stop it? And generally speaking, you stop violence with a stronger force. And something you have to think through carefully.
Historically, this is where, so just war theory developed, like Christians developed just war theory, but early Christians did believe you should not fight in war. Origin, and that like war is wrong. And then, but war was all around. And so Christians had to address that. And so just war theory, beginning with Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, has been developed and developed carefully. And it has all of these principles that Leanne has mentioned. Importantly, though, pacifists, so historical pacifism, and there are a number of Christian denominations that advocate for pacifism, but even the pacifism that those groups have advocated for has changed over time. So initially, it was you stay out of war. But then beginning in around the 20th century with sort of the arms race and that led to World War I, what we begin seeing among Christian pacifists at that time is moving from just staying out of war to working actively to create circumstances that lead to peace. So both just war and pacifism are Christian perspectives on war. There is no single Christian perspective on war. Do you want? Nope.
Okay, we probably have time for one more question or comment. Yes, Ivan. I'll repeat your question. So I asked and I'll repeat. Question is war is does Paul Evans agree with the UN? Is war a rational choice, or was it a bad choice? Rational.
A rationally bad choice. I can't agree with that across the board in every instance. I think it would depend on the circumstance.
That sounds like a description of my teenage years. But with that, we don't have time for me to elaborate on those years. So unfortunately for me. But yeah, so Paul and everyone, there's another event that's going to start in 7:30. That's here. That's why I'm making an abrupt ending. But want to, I want to, if Paul will be here until 1 a.m. And if you want to talk to him in the lobby, invite you to do, or to Leanne, Robyn, and Shannon, although they are only here till midnight. And I want to thank you all for bringing more cowbell. I left it back there. It's on my thing. Otherwise, I'd give it a ring. Thank you for the presentations you gave, Paul, for traveling, and for our panelists for the time and effort that they put in this. Also, thank all of you for being here. This would be an immensely less fun experience if it was an empty room. It was just what, the five of us, or one, four, yes, five of us. So thank you, appreciate you coming, and yeah, hope to see you again. We're having another event in a couple of weeks. So yes, okay.